Picture this: May 22nd, 1947. The Latin Quarter of Paris, where narrow streets still bear scars from 4 years of German occupation, and where Allied intelligence services maintain networks that officially don't exist. Captain Edward Thornberry, a 38-year-old MI6 officer operating under diplomatic cover at the British Embassy, walks through the rain toward a safe house on Rue des Écoles that British intelligence has used since liberation to debrief agents returning from behind the Iron Curtain. At 21:47 hours, he radios the embassy duty officer, confirming arrival at the safe house and estimating 2 hours for the debriefing session he's conducting with a Czech defector. At 21:49 hours, a French police officer on routine patrol sees Thornberry enter the building through its courtyard entrance. At 23:51 hours, when Thornberry fails to check in as required, MI6 station chief attempts radio contact. There's no response. Search teams arriving at the safe house within 30 minutes find the door unlocked, the interior undisturbed, but Captain Thornberry has vanished. The Czech defector he'd been meeting is gone as well. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced exit, just empty rooms and the lingering smell of cigarette smoke from a conversation that apparently concluded minutes before searchers arrived. For 78 years, Thornberry's disappearance would remain one of MI6's most troubling unsolved mysteries, a case that British, French, American, and Soviet intelligence all investigated without reaching conclusions any would publicly acknowledge. Until 2025, when renovation crews preparing the building for conversion into luxury apartments discover a sealed room behind the safe house's basement wall containing equipment that predates the Cold War, documents written in codes that survived the digital age, and evidence that Captain Edward Thornberry didn't die on that rainy Paris night in 1947. He discovered something that 4 intelligence services had spent 78 years ensuring stayed hidden from public scrutiny and historical examination. Edward Thornberry wasn't a conventional spy. Born in 1909 to a family of career diplomats, he'd grown up in embassy compounds across Europe, speaking French, German, and Russian before mastering English. He'd joined the Foreign Office in 1932, served in Berlin during Hitler's rise to power, and been recruited by MI6 in 1938 when war seemed inevitable and Britain needed intelligence officers who understood continental politics from personal experience rather than academic study. His wartime service had been distinguished but deliberately obscure. He'd coordinated resistance networks in occupied France, managed agents behind German lines, and developed relationships with Soviet intelligence officers during the uneasy alliance that defeated Hitler. By 1945, when war ended and the alliance crumbled into suspicion and competition, Thornberry had established himself as one of MI6's most valuable officers, trusted by superiors to handle sensitive operations that required both technical competence and diplomatic finesse. His posting to Paris in 1946 came at a critical moment in Cold War development. France was politically unstable, with communist parties gaining strength and Soviet intelligence operating aggressively to influence French politics and recruit agents throughout Western Europe. British intelligence needed officers who could work with French services while also monitoring Soviet activities and protecting British interests in a country that might swing either toward Western alliance or Eastern influence. Thornberry's personal letters, preserved by his sister Margaret in England and donated to intelligence archives after declassification in 2019, documented his growing unease about the work he was doing. In April 1947, just weeks before his disappearance, he'd written words that Margaret would obsess over for decades. "Maggie, the war we're fighting now isn't cleaner than the one we just won. It's murkier, more ambiguous, involving compromises that would have been unthinkable before 1945. We work with former Nazis because they have intelligence about Soviets. We ignore Soviet crimes because we need their cooperation on issues that matter more than justice for their victims. And increasingly, I wonder if the sides we've chosen are as clear-cut as we pretend they are." His final letter, mailed on May 20th, contained observations that would haunt investigators for 78 years. "I'm meeting a Czech defector tomorrow night. Standard debriefing at the safe house on Rue des Écoles. but there's something about this operation that doesn't feel right. The defector contacted us through channels that are too clean, his story is too perfect, and my superiors are too eager to hear what he has to say without questioning why Soviet intelligence would let such a valuable source escape. I'm proceeding with the meeting because orders are orders. But if something happens, if this goes wrong, tell Colonel Whitmore at headquarters that I suspected we were being played. That someone wanted me in that safe house at that specific time for reasons that had nothing to do with debriefing a defector. The safe house on Rue des Écoles had been established in August 1944 immediately after Paris's liberation, requisitioned from a French property owner who'd collaborated with German occupation and whose assets were confiscated by authorities. The building was a typical Latin Quarter structure, 5 stories of 18th-century architecture housing apartments that British intelligence had converted into secure facilities for operations that required privacy and deniability. The safe house had been used extensively from 1944 through 1947, serving as meeting point for agents, debriefing center for defectors, and occasionally as temporary accommodation for intelligence officers who needed to operate in Paris without embassy connections that might compromise their covers. Security was maintained through layers of procedural discipline, regular sweeps for listening devices, and careful screening of everyone who entered. The building had never been penetrated by hostile intelligence, at least not in ways that British authorities detected. Thornberry's meeting on May 22nd had been arranged through a Czech resistance contact who'd reported that a mid-level intelligence officer from Prague wanted to defect, bringing with him information about Soviet operations in Western Europe. The defector, identified in MI6 files only as Source Baker, claimed to have access to Soviet intelligence networks that British authorities desperately wanted to understand. Thornberry had been assigned to conduct initial debriefing, assess the defector's credibility, and determine whether he warranted extraction to London for more detailed interrogation. The meeting had been scheduled for 2200 hours, giving Thornberry time to prepare the safe house and review what little information MI6 possessed about Source Baker. He'd arrived early, as protocol required, conducting security sweeps and ensuring the safe house was ready for a session that might last several hours. His radio call at 21:47 hours had been routine, confirming arrival and estimated duration. Nothing in his voice or message suggested concern or suspicion. The French police officer who'd seen Thornberry enter the building, a patrolman named Claude Moreau, assigned to the Latin Quarter, had testified extensively during the investigation. He'd been walking his beat on Rue des Écoles around 21:45 hours when he'd noticed a man matching Thornberry's description enter the courtyard of the building that police records identified as British diplomatic property. Moreau had noted the time in his patrol log and continued his rounds, thinking nothing unusual about diplomatic personnel working late hours. At 23:51 hours, when Thornberry failed to make his required check-in call, the MI6 duty officer at the embassy attempted radio contact. When that produced no response, the duty officer called the safe house's landline telephone. No answer. By 23:58 hours, an emergency protocol had been activated, and a 4-person response team was en route to Rue des Écoles, prepared for situations ranging from radio equipment failure to hostile action requiring immediate extraction. The team arrived at 00:17 hours on May 23rd and found the courtyard entrance unlocked, exactly as Thornberry would have left it to allow Source Baker to enter. The building's interior showed no signs of disturbance. Lights were on in the third-floor apartment that served as the safe house's primary meeting space. The door to that apartment was also unlocked. But when the team entered, weapons drawn and prepared for confrontation, they found empty rooms. No Thornberry, no Source Baker, no evidence of what had occurred during the hours between Thornberry's arrival and the team's response. The investigation that followed consumed weeks and involved MI6, French intelligence, SDECE, and eventually CIA officers who were establishing their own presence in Paris. They interviewed every resident of the building, every business owner on the street, every contact who might have information about Thornberry's activities or Source Baker's identity. They conducted detailed forensic examination of the safe house, looking for evidence of struggle, concealed exits, or anything that might explain how two men could vanish from a secure location without being seen leaving. They found nothing conclusive. The safe house showed signs of recent occupation, cigarettes in an ashtray suggesting two people had been smoking, glasses on a table indicating drinks had been served, but no personal effects belonging to either Thornberry or Source Baker. No documents related to the debriefing. No clues about where they'd gone or whether their departure had been voluntary or coerced. The most extensive search focused on the building's structure, examining whether hidden passages or concealed exits might exist that architectural plans didn't show. Engineers brought in sophisticated equipment for 1947, using acoustic methods and limited X-ray technology to examine walls and floors. They found nothing that suggested secret passages or concealed spaces. The building was exactly what it appeared to be, a converted residential structure with no hidden features that could explain the disappearance. The official MI6 investigation concluded in August 1947 with a report that acknowledged multiple possibilities without committing to any as definitive. Thornberry and Source Baker might have been captured by Soviet intelligence through methods that left no evidence. They might have defected voluntarily, though Thornberry's loyalty was considered beyond question. They might have been killed and their bodies disposed of through means that investigators couldn't determine. Or the entire operation might have been a Soviet intelligence provocation designed to eliminate or compromise a valuable British officer while demonstrating capabilities that would intimidate other Western intelligence services. Margaret Thornberry was notified that her brother was missing, presumed killed in circumstances that remained under investigation. She spent the rest of her life searching for answers, writing to MI6 annually requesting updates, hiring private investigators who found nothing, and eventually publishing a memoir in 1983 that accused British intelligence of knowing more about Edward's fate than they'd admitted. The memoir was largely ignored, dismissed as the conspiracy theorizing of a grieving sister who couldn't accept that sometimes people disappeared without explanation in the murky world of intelligence operations. For 78 years, the safe house on Rue des Écoles continued serving British intelligence interests, though its use became less frequent as Cold War operations evolved and more sophisticated facilities were established. By 2010, MI6 had largely abandoned the building, and it was sold through intermediaries to private developers. The building sat empty for years while ownership was disputed and renovation plans were debated. Finally, in 2024, a development company specializing in historic Parisian properties acquired it with plans to convert the apartments into luxury residences targeting wealthy international buyers. Renovation work began in January 2025, starting with structural surveys and architectural assessments. On March 8, 2025, contractors examining the basement for moisture damage and foundation issues detected an anomaly. A section of wall in the building's deepest level showed acoustic properties suggesting hollow space beyond it, space that architectural plans from multiple periods didn't account for. Further investigation revealed that the wall was relatively recent construction, probably post-1945, built to conceal whatever lay behind it. The decision to breach the wall was made on March 15, after consultations with French authorities and discreet inquiries to British intelligence about whether the building contained classified materials that shouldn't be disturbed. When no objections were raised, contractors carefully removed the concealing wall, revealing a steel door bearing British military specifications and warning signs indicating secure area requiring authorized access. What lay beyond that door would finally answer questions about Captain Edward Thornberry's disappearance and reveal why a safe house in Paris's Latin Quarter had mattered enough in 1947 that an MI6 officer's investigation of it had resulted in his vanishing from historical record for nearly 8 decades. The steel door opened into a descending stairwell that no architectural plans from any period acknowledged existed. French authorities immediately contacted British intelligence, who dispatched a team from MI6's Historical Investigations Unit to Paris within 24 hours. By March 18, 2025, a joint French-British team had descended the stairs and begun documenting what lay beneath the safe house that Captain Edward Thornberry had entered 78 years earlier. The underground facility was extensive, far larger than the building's footprint suggested was possible. Engineers would later determine that it extended beneath adjacent properties, connecting to catacombs and medieval tunnel systems that honeycombed the Latin Quarter's bedrock. But this wasn't simply expanded natural space. It had been deliberately constructed, reinforced with steel and concrete, equipped with electrical systems and ventilation that suggested long-term occupation rather than temporary storage. The main chamber was approximately 40 meters long and 20 meters wide, divided into functional areas that told a story investigators hadn't anticipated. One section contained communications equipment, radio systems far more sophisticated than what MI6 had been using in 1947. Designed for encrypted transmission on frequencies that intelligence services monitoring Paris in that period wouldn't have been watching. Another section held what appeared to be a small laboratory, chemistry equipment, and testing apparatus suggesting scientific work rather than standard intelligence operations. But it was the third section, arranged as living quarters and office space, that provided the first concrete evidence of Captain Thornberry's fate. A desk contained documents bearing Thornberry's handwriting, reports, and journals that documented his activities not just on May 22, 1947, but for years afterward. The investigation team photographed everything before touching anything, understanding they were documenting evidence of a mystery that had consumed intelligence resources for nearly 8 decades. Thornberry's primary journal began on May 22, 1947, at 21:50 hours, just minutes after he'd entered the safe house to meet Source Baker. Meeting commenced as scheduled. Source Baker arrived punctually, presenting credentials that match briefing materials provided by Check Contact. Initial assessment suggests genuine defector, but I'm maintaining skepticism until his information can be verified. He claims knowledge of Soviet intelligence networks in France that British authorities have completely missed. If true, implications are significant. The subsequent entries documented what happened during that meeting, revelations that explained everything about Thornberry's disappearance and why it had remained unsolved for 78 years. 2,237 hours. Source Baker has revealed that he's not a defector. He represents what he calls the Intelligence Synthesis Project, an organization that exists outside national intelligence services, but which monitors and occasionally intervenes in their operations. He's shown me credentials from British, American, Soviet, and French intelligence, all apparently genuine, suggesting he operates with knowledge, if not explicit approval, from multiple governments. Thornberry's journal revealed his initial skepticism and his demand for evidence that Source Baker was who he claimed to be. 2,314 hours. He's taken me to a section of the safe house I didn't know existed, accessed through what I thought was a sealed utility closet but which conceals stairs to an underground facility. This facility has been operating beneath British intelligence's safe house for at least 2 years. Monitoring our operations while conducting its own activities that apparently serve purposes all intelligence services benefit from, but which no single service controls. The journal documented Thornberry's exploration of the underground facility throughout the night of May 22nd and into the morning of May 23rd. He'd found evidence of what the Intelligence Synthesis Project did, collecting information from multiple intelligence services, analyzing patterns that individual services couldn't see because of bureaucratic compartmentalization, and occasionally sharing synthesized intelligence with all parties when doing so served collective security interests without compromising any single nation's advantages. But Thornberry's journal also documented his growing understanding that the project represented something unprecedented in intelligence history. May 23rd, 03:42 hours. I've spent 7 hours reviewing documents and interviewing Source Baker, whose real name is apparently Thomas Garrett, though he admits that might also be cover identity. What I'm seeing challenges everything I thought I understood about how intelligence operates in the post-war world. The project isn't loyal to any nation, it's loyal to what Garrett calls intelligence integrity, the principle that some information is too important to be monopolized by any single service or suppressed for political convenience. The journal revealed that Thornberry had been given the same choice that other intelligence officers before him had faced when they'd stumbled onto the project's operations: leave, report finding nothing unusual at the safe house, and return to normal duties, or remain as British observer, understanding the project's work and ensuring it didn't threaten UK security while serving as liaison between the project and MI6 handlers who'd be contacted through channels that protected both parties from complications if the arrangement became known. Thornberry's internal struggle with this decision was documented over 3 days spent in the underground facility. May 24th, 15:34 hours. Garrett has given me until tomorrow to decide. He's explained that the project operates with tacit approval from intelligence chiefs in multiple countries, all of whom recognize that certain intelligence requires cooperation that official channels can't accommodate because of political constraints. The project fills that gap, synthesizing information from sources that wouldn't normally share with each other and occasionally preventing disasters that might result from one service acting without knowledge of what others know. The journal documented specific examples Garrett had shown Thornberry of the project's work. Intelligence about Soviet atomic espionage that had been shared with Western services before Klaus Fuchs was arrested, preventing greater damage. Information about Western intelligence operations that had been passed to Soviet services when those operations threatened to trigger conflicts that would have benefited no one. And most significantly, evidence of Nazi war criminals who were being protected by intelligence services from multiple nations, information that the project was preserving as insurance against those arrangements becoming permanent rather than temporary expedients. Thornberry's decision, documented in an entry dated May 25, 1947, explained why he'd never emerged from the safe house and why MI6 had never found conclusive evidence of what happened to him. I'm staying, not because I've been coerced or because I no longer value British interests, because I believe intelligence that serves collective security rather than narrow national advantage is worth protecting. I'll serve as British observer, monitoring the project to ensure it doesn't compromise UK operations while it continues work that ultimately benefits all nations, including Britain. The investigation team found extensive evidence that Thornberry had indeed lived in the underground facility for years after his reported disappearance. Personal quarters showing long-term occupation. Letters to his sister Margaret that had been written but never mailed, documenting his life as an observer and his complex feelings about the choice he'd made. And a second journal covering the period from 1947 to 1956, revealing that Thornberry had served as one of several national observers stationed at intelligence synthesis project facilities across Europe during the early Cold War. This second journal painted a detailed picture of Thornberry's daily life as an observer, reviewing intelligence that the project collected from multiple sources, communicating with MI6 handlers through dead drops and encrypted messages that couldn't be traced to the underground facility, attending meetings with observers from other nations where they discussed how to balance protecting the project's independence against preventing it from being exploited by any single intelligence service, and wrestling constantly with questions about whether his work served British interests or betrayed them. The journal documented several crises where Thornberry had played crucial roles in preventing disasters. In 1948, when Soviet intelligence prepared to arrest Western agents in Berlin based on information from a double agent, Thornberry had coordinated with American and French observers to warn the targeted agents without revealing how the project had learned about the Soviet operation. In 1950, when MI6 planned an operation in Prague that would have compromised a Soviet source who was providing valuable intelligence to multiple Western services, Thornberry had convinced his handlers to postpone the operation, though he couldn't explain his reasoning without revealing the project's existence. In 1952, when the Rosenberg atomic espionage case threatened to expose intelligence sources that multiple nations wanted protected, Thornberry had helped draft arrangements that satisfied American prosecutors' needs for convictions while keeping the most sensitive sources out of public testimony. And in 1954, when the Petrov affair in Australia risked triggering wider intelligence conflicts between Western and Soviet services, Thornberry had been part of a team that negotiated informal protocols preventing the situation from escalating. But the journal also documented the personal costs of Thornberry's service: isolation from friends and family, inability to maintain relationships that required explaining where he worked or what he did, constant awareness that he was living a lie, that people who'd cared about him believed he was dead, and that his choice to join the project had inflicted pain on others for purposes they'd never understand. The entries from the early 1950s showed a man wrestling with depression, questioning whether the work he was doing justified the sacrifices he'd made. The turning point came in 1954, documented in entries that suggested Thornberry had reached a crisis point. August 17, 1954. I've been underground 7 years. 7 years of monitoring intelligence that prevents disasters, but which also perpetuates systems that create those disasters. 7 years of serving principles that transcend national loyalty while wondering if transcendence is just another word for betrayal. Garrett argues that the project prevents wars, but I increasingly wonder if it simply manages conflicts that serve intelligence services' interests in ways that populations whose taxes fund those services would never approve if they understood what we're actually doing. The journal revealed that Thornberry had requested release from observer duty in late 1954, arguing that he'd served long enough and wanted to attempt reintegration into civilian life. The project had agreed, with conditions. He'd be given a new identity, relocated to a country where MI6 presence was minimal, and provided with pension and support funds that officially didn't exist. He'd maintain contact with project handlers throughout his life, available for consultation if his expertise was needed, but he'd no longer serve as active observer. Thornberry's final journal entry as an observer was dated January 7, 1956. Tomorrow I leave. I'll become Richard Hartley, New Zealand journalist with fabricated history that will withstand any investigation short of intelligence service resources. I'll live in Auckland, write about international affairs without revealing how I actually know what I claim to analyze, and try to build something resembling normal life from the ruins of the identity I abandoned 9 years ago. Margaret will never know I survived. My friends from before the war will never learn what happened to Edward Thornberry. And I'll spend whatever years remain wondering if the work I did justified the prices I paid and the pain I caused. The investigation team found documentation of Thornberry's reintegration in files that the project's successors had maintained with meticulous attention to detail. He'd lived in Auckland under his assumed identity from 1956 until his death in 1987 at age 78. He'd worked as an international affairs journalist, written several respected books analyzing Cold War developments, and maintained a low profile that attracted no intelligence service attention despite his insights into events that few outside classified circles understood. He'd never married, never established close personal relationships that might require explaining his past, and never revealed his actual history to anyone, including the few friends he'd made in New Zealand. He'd maintained contact with project handlers throughout his life, providing consultation on intelligence matters when his expertise was needed, but he'd never resumed active observer duties. And most significantly, he'd written a memoir in the final year of his life, a document intended for eventual release explaining what the Intelligence Synthesis Project had been and why he'd believed serving it was worth sacrificing everything, including his identity. That memoir, discovered among the documents in the underground facility, provided the most comprehensive explanation of what the project had accomplished and why multiple governments had agreed to protect its existence despite the political complications that revelation would have created. Thornberry argued that intelligence in the nuclear age required cooperation that official channels couldn't accommodate, that preventing catastrophic conflicts justified arrangements that would have been unthinkable before Hiroshima made clear that future wars might end civilization. He acknowledged the moral complexities of his choice, the arguments that could be made that he'd betrayed his oath to serve Britain by joining an organization that served no single nation. But he also argued that Britain's interests were ultimately served by intelligence cooperation that prevented nuclear war. That narrow national advantage meant nothing if the price was potential extinction. Whether that justification satisfied those who'd been hurt by his disappearance, whether it excused the lies and deceptions required to maintain the project's secrecy, Thornberry admitted he didn't know. The French government's response to the facility's discovery was immediate and comprehensive, mirroring patterns from previous revelations about intelligence arrangements from the early Cold War. The site was classified at the highest security levels. Contents were cataloged under protocols that ensured only those with absolute need to know would ever access them. And diplomatic consultations were held with British, American, Russian, and German governments about how to handle evidence of arrangements that none had publicly acknowledged. Eventually, consensus emerged that satisfied political needs while revealing minimal truth. The facility would be described as a communications center from the early Cold War period, used for liaison purposes between Western intelligence services, now obsolete and of historical interest only. The Intelligence Synthesis Project would not be acknowledged, its operations would remain classified indefinitely, and the truth about what observers like Thornberry had actually been doing would be protected by classification that ensured current officials could deny knowledge while preventing future revelations. But Thornberry's family was contacted, given partial information that authorities determined was both deserved and safe to reveal. In May 2025, Margaret Thornberry's granddaughter Emma, who'd grown up hearing stories about her great-uncle's mysterious disappearance and her grandmother's lifelong search for answers, received notification from MI6. Captain Thornberry had indeed disappeared in 1947, but not through capture or accident. He'd discovered a classified intelligence facility, had remained to serve as observer under circumstances that required his official death, and had lived until 1987 under assumed identity in New Zealand, where he'd died of natural causes at age 78. Emma was given access to some of Thornberry's letters, the ones he'd written to Margaret but never sent, documenting his life as Richard Hartley and his enduring connection to the family he'd abandoned. She was also shown portions of his memoir, explaining his choices and the principles he'd believed justified sacrificing personal identity for intelligence cooperation. And she was told, in language carefully crafted to reveal truth without compromising security, that her great-uncle had served purposes that transcended his military oath, that his sacrifice had contributed to preventing conflicts that might have triggered nuclear war, and that he'd never stopped regretting pain his disappearance had caused, despite believing his choice had been necessary. The response from those who learned partial truths was mixed. Some, like Emma, found closure in understanding that Thornberry hadn't died violently, that he'd made conscious choices rather than being victim of circumstances beyond his control. Others, particularly in intelligence communities, were disturbed by evidence that senior officers from multiple services had operated outside official channels, creating parallel structures that answered to no government and served principles that bureaucratic oversight couldn't assess. The debate about whether arrangements like the Intelligence Synthesis Project had been justified consumed classified discussions for months. Defenders argued that nuclear weapons had created situations where traditional intelligence competition risked catastrophic consequences, that cooperation preventing World War III justified methods that peacetime morality might condemn. Critics argued that intelligence officers serving organizations outside government control violated fundamental principles of democratic accountability, that no ends justified means that placed individuals above the institutions they'd sworn to serve. The safe house on Rue des Écoles was sold to private developers as planned, though the underground facility was sealed before renovation proceeded. The entrance was concealed so thoroughly that future construction would find nothing to reveal, and the building's new owners were told only that minor structural work had been required to address foundation issues discovered during initial surveys. A small memorial plaque was installed in the courtyard, acknowledging that Captain Edward Thornberry, MY6 officer, had disappeared at this location in 1947, and that he'd given his life in service to ideals that intelligence authorities still considered too sensitive to fully explain. But among those few who knew the complete truth, who'd read Thornberry's journals and understood what the Intelligence Synthesis Project represented, there was acknowledgement that Cold War intelligence history was more complex than public narratives suggested, that some officers had served purposes that transcended national service, that preventing nuclear war had sometimes required cooperation that official channels couldn't accommodate, and that the line between protecting security and maintaining democratic accountability had been contested throughout the period in ways that simple classifications of loyalty and betrayal couldn't capture. Captain Edward Thornberry had walked through a safe-house door on May 22, 1947, and vanished into a world where intelligence service transcended national borders. He'd spent 9 years as observer protecting cooperation that multiple nations needed but couldn't officially acknowledge, and he'd emerged into civilian life in New Zealand carrying secrets that would remain buried for 78 years before being partially revealed to descendants who struggled to understand why their relative had chosen intelligence integrity over family, principles over personal identity, and exile over recognition for service that official histories would never acknowledge. The secrets revealed in the Paris safe house weren't crimes, but compromises. Not betrayals, but sacrifices made by individuals who believed that preventing nuclear war required commitments that conventional loyalty couldn't accommodate. Whether those commitments were justified, whether Thornberry's choice to serve the Intelligence Synthesis Project was ethical, those remained questions that different people answered differently depending on whether they valued democratic accountability over preventing catastrophic conflict, or whether they believed preventing extinction justified any means including creating intelligence structures outside government control. For Emma Thornberry and others who learned their relatives' fates, there was at least understanding that disappearance had meant something beyond capture or death. That sacrifice had served purposes that transcended individual nations even if those purposes remained controversial and contested. And there was recognition that Cold War intelligence, far from being the clear-cut struggle between freedom and tyranny that popular narratives suggested, had involved moral complexities and institutional arrangements that challenged comfortable assumptions about how democratic societies should conduct secret operations in pursuit of security that all citizens needed but which few understood the true costs of maintaining. The underground facility beneath Rue des Écoles had been one node in a network that extended across Europe during the early Cold War. Places where intelligence officers from nations that were supposed to be adversaries had cooperated to prevent the conflicts their governments seemed determined to risk. Whether that cooperation had prevented World War III, whether it had merely delayed inevitable confrontations, or whether it had created precedents for intelligence operations outside democratic control that undermined the values it claimed to protect, those were questions that historians would debate long after the last observers from the Intelligence Synthesis Project had died, taking their full stories to graves scattered across continents and decades. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.